Hello, YouTubers. Well, it's been some years, maybe 10 years since I've done any broadcasting, and I've been encouraged by a couple people to do some. So I'm just actually testing it out at the moment. Let me talk about one interesting phenomenon. It's called the law of unintended consequences. And this, I think, sums up much of what happens in our lives. By the way, I'm recording here from what I call the Bear Cave. It's my place where I do my studies and where I do any kind of native crafts that I do. Anyway, so embarking on this idea of the law of unintended consequences, there's a really interesting example that comes out of India from back in the early part of the last century when the British had taken control of the country. As many people know who've studied that part of the world, they've got a huge problem with poisonous snakes, venomous snakes as they're called in the real herpetology world. Among them are huge cobra issues. And this happens oftentimes in the cities themselves, like cities like New Delhi and the immediate outskirts of places like that. So, because of this problem, the British government put a bounty on the snakes. So everyone you turned in, you got a certain amount of money. And they're real excited about this program because it created a whole world of snake catchers. Excuse me. But it didn't take long before the snake catchers got smart. The thing about the people from India is people from India are very industrious people. That's one of the things the British could never get a hold of, is understanding that about the people of India. And it's ironic that me being Cherokee, we're kind of known for the same thing as being industrious in the sense of business-wise. We're always at every powwow selling stuff, making stuff, you know, that kind of idea. With the people from India are the same way. So what they decided to do was, heck, why are we going around everywhere searching for snakes when we could just get these snakes and start breeding them? So what they did is captured a few snakes, and they literally had hundreds of people across the country that captured those snakes, and they started taking those snakes, breeding them up, and then turning them into the British government in India. And the Raj, as the British government was called, was astounded at how diligent the people were at getting rid of these snakes until they found out that the snakes were still there in those cities, but they were coming up with these multiple thousands of other snakes. They finally got it all figured out when someone told them, you know, these snakes are actually coming from the breeding program that these people have developed. And that's what they ended up calling from then on the Cobra principle. Whenever the British were talking about the idea of the law of unintended consequences, they called it the Cobra principle. And this is kind of what I want to kind of go in the direction of. You know, we've been talking about divesting and going in different directions. Oftentimes there's laws of unintended consequences that create circumstances that make the whole entire equation different. Now, those things may take place overnight, and sometimes they do. I'll give you an example. In the 1960s, there was, before President Johnson, you remember Kennedy, then Johnson, before President Johnson created what he called the Great Society, in the black home, there was only 7 to 10% illegitimacy. There was some of the largest actual family home-owned business in the country. In other words, there was an industriousness and a diligence that was there. And this was even better than the numbers that were in the white home, because in the white families, at that time, there was well over 10% illegitimacy. So what happened is the concept of the Great Society was that they would target primarily welfare homes that they were going to give welfare to. And the concept of the word welfare comes out from the idea that the government was supposed to look after the general welfare of the people. And they just coined that term welfare to explain the giveaway program that they were going to establish under this Great Society, which program, by the way, Johnson tried to sell to the North Vietnamese and saying that he was going to make the Mekong Delta like the TVA Authority and the building up the TVA Authority that happened in the Tennessee Valley and the industriousness of it if they would just go along with his programs. Of course, it didn't happen. They turned it down and he increased the war there so much that everything we hear about that we blame on Nixon really came down to Johnson. In Kennedy's time at that time, it was mainly primarily Special Forces advisors and guys like that. Marine Corps recon guys and different people like that, Navy SEALs. But once Johnson got in there, he turned half a generation over to there. We end up with 58,000 people killed and a country torn in half. That's a law of unintended consequences. And he kind of did it as a reaction because the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese didn't accept his TVA Authority thing that he thought would be able to change the economy of Vietnam. I can't say whether he had good intentions or bad intentions. It was bad outcome, unintended. Same thing happened with the welfare system, targeting primarily the poor and specifically the black home. Now, many of us know about Johnson's early days. Johnson was an incredibly bigoted man, but he was also a smart man. He was involved with the Gambino family, and in fact, later on, his daughter married Chuck Robb, who was the governor of the state of Virginia, and he was caught up in scandals after scandals for gambling in illegal gambling places while governor in the state of Virginia at Gambino gambling places in Virginia Beach, where the state police did bust and found him actually in the process of gambling. So anyway, this targeting of the black home was that benefits could be given, but there could not be a man in the home. Think about that. You know, the black family had been destroyed through slavery. And then after slavery in the South, you had Jim Crow, which was run by the Democrat Party, the same people who ran slavery. At the founding of this nation, 77 years, that's 87 years before the Gettysburg Address is given by Lincoln, the nation was founded. And out of the 13 original colonies, 7 of the colonies had laws against slavery. And in fact, most of the 7 had their own personal declarations of why they were breaking away from England as colonies and were becoming states in a new United States. And those declarations stated very clearly because they were tired of being forced to have slavery in their colony, which England demanded. So there was created this Mason-Dixon line that everybody who was on the south side of the Mason-Dixon line was in a slave state. Everybody on the north side was in a free state. And if you could make your way from the south to the north as a slave, you'd be free. This went on until the Dred Scott decision in 1858, which sued the Southerners sued a man, Dred Scott, who had escaped and was free, but they sued him for the possession of his 2 daughters because he had died by the time the court got to the Supreme Court, because in their mind he was still chattel, even though he was in the North. And the Supreme Court ruled that at that point, nobody was free, and it extended the Underground Railroad from the Mason-Dixon line, which is roughly along the state of Virginia and a couple others along there, all the way to the Canadian border that you had to go to escape on the Underground Railroad to be free. So the Democrat Party, the party of slavery, once they lost the war and during the Reconstruction, created a thing called Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is what we would call apartheid in American history. And they ran this diligently, even though immediately after the Civil War during the Reconstruction, there was massive amount of black former slaves elected to office. You know, they always talk about the first governor or the first senator of Virginia being black, being in the last 20 years, but the first senator of Virginia that was black, United States senator, was immediately after the Civil War. He's a Republican. So the Republicans are basically driven back in the South and had very little control of the South at all, and in fact were the only ones who would allow blacks to vote. And the Democrats ran their Jim Crow program on and on and on, all the way from the time of the Civil War, all the way up into the time of the Voting Rights Act. In fact, in 1963, at the Democrat convention in Atlantic City, talking about the National Convention, political convention, 1963 or 62, they would not allow blacks on the floor of the convention. Think about that. That's incredible. And yet, during all of this time, the black home was built so that it had a lower illegitimacy rate than the white home. And the black home was not producing a generational poverty. It's an amazing thing when you think about the resilience of the black home from those times. Because before that, there was no homes allowed under slavery. After slavery and through all the process of Jim Crow, all the persecution, all the stuff that the Democratic Party did, the refusal allowing them to vote in any Democratic ticket, up until the Voting Rights Act, which basically just dealt with the Democrat Party's refusal to allow them, not even allowing them to have a seat on the convention floor. The home was built. It had a higher family unit rate than the white society, and we're not talking about Hispanics or Asians because there's very few of them at the time in the country. There was no generational poverty. The emphasis was education. And though the actual infrastructure of the schools that were attended by black students, primarily in areas like, let's take, for instance, Washington, D.C., which I'm very familiar with. I've studied it quite a bit. So I've done many years of work there. In the city of Washington, D.C., the prime schools like Roosevelt, Gibson, places like that, Eastern, produced some of the greatest athletes and some of the good quality scholars, with 95 to 97% of all the students graduating from college, and a higher rate of college graduation on top of that, maybe twice to three times as much as what's graduating from many schools in the city of D.C. today, after there's been a change in everything. It was a very strong pride in getting things done so that you could advance out of generational poverty. So welfare, whether Johnson did it because he was a socialist or whether he did it because he was just stupid, destroyed the black home. And now we have 75% illegitimacy rate, and on top of that, 55 to 60% abortion rate of black babies. The schools like Eastern, that were great schools, produced some of the best athletes. The only people that were athletic enough on the football teams and on the basketball teams to be able to compete with those public schools in the city of D.C. were very expensive schools that were run by the Catholic church groups, like Gonzaga, St. John's, places like that. So these unintended consequences destroyed the black home. Completely annihilated it. So this illegitimacy rate went 10 times as high. And it produced in the structures the destruction of the black male. Black men were kicked out in order for welfare benefits to be had. Black men were kicked out. So now what we have in the inner cities around the country, in the United States, and I've studied a lot about this, because I worked for many, many years working in the inner cities of Washington, D.C., in public housing, the whole time that it was the high murder rate it was. We set up outreach houses there and ministry houses down in there, and some of the worst places in town, Valley Green, Washington Highlands, Berry Farms, Montana Terrace, Potomac Gardens. All of that time in those times, black males were kicked to the curb. And in the United States, all across the country in these inner cities, the black male is pushed out of existence and out of the home. He's given a second-rate status in this country. And this is the law of unintended consequences, because he was not allowed to partake of any government benefit. If his family was in need, he had to leave for the family to be taken care of. And so what's happened now is, because we have in the inner cities a 55% high school dropout rate, and 65 to 70% of those dropouts are males, we have a permanent black male underclass. And I've worked with youth gangs on the streets in D.C. for many years. And the thing that I found was a ironic thing. So I set up education programs and feeding programs in the public housing areas. I started in Berry Farms doing that in Valley Green. When I found out, the most ironic thing was some of the very most feared street guys, and I'm talking about, the street crews. DC doesn't have a big thing with the Crips and Bloods. It's got neighborhood street crews, which makes it why it was so violent. Even the Jamaicans and those characters couldn't establish themselves in the city because they had to fight street crew by street crew. So I found that generally the young guy, that some of these were run by 14, 15-year-old young men. And the young guy that ran it was generally a very sharp young guy, that, not having been subject to this insanity of the way that things were being run, probably would have been the guy that just a mere 25 years before excelled as a college graduate, having gone through a school that was no longer a gang-related haven for corrupt activities. So this was a law of unintended consequences. And so these guys oftentimes didn't even get a high school diploma until they finished up a short period of time in jail, or a long period of time in jail. Like down here at the federal penitentiary, because being in the city of DC, everything was a federal crime when they did something that was a serious crime. So my aim was to try to catch these guys and to try to work with them to try to get them educated. And that's exactly what my process was at the time. And it had some good success. Many of them ended up having jobs where they went from being gangbangers on the street to actually working for the city, doing things, getting jobs, getting their high school diploma, which is a very rare thing for many of these young guys. It's gotten so bad in many of these schools as a law of unintended consequences that schools at one time in the 1970s and late 70s were the number one football schools of the entire city that won metropolitan, when I say metropolitan, I mean Virginia, D.C., and Maryland championships, can't even field enough young men to produce a football team. And the reason is because of the fact that their lives are so disarrayed and there's so much violence that goes on. I mean, I was a sponsor for many years of Basketball Under the Stars, and also boxing under the stars. You know, we had greats like Riddick Bowe go through there. We had great basketball young men who did things that you would have to get to somebody with the level of LeBron James to see people beating these guys in what they could do. The athleticism was incredible, but they had no structure in their life because they were being raised in single mother homes, no father image whatsoever, high school dropouts, so they're never going to be promoted any place past that court in their street. But I've seen them do incredible athletic displays. And all of this I'm saying just basically to give it an idea that society has produced some seriously unintended consequences. And so we have this thing called disinvestment. I guess that's the word, disinvestment, that we're hearing about. And it's where individuals of a particular racial categorization decide they're going to step outside of that categorization and advance themselves individually without regard to what anybody else says about that. And I think that this is a good thing for a lot of reasons. And I'll give you my basic reason beyond anything else that I've got to say about it. Then, you know, over the course of these next videos, hopefully I'll be able to give clarity about how I think it can operate the best. You know, I'm not a young guy. I'm 65 years old and was married for 20 years. I'm a widower. Raised my 4 sons, helped raise my nephews, and then also mentor a number of young guys that are my son's age. And I've told them that it's smart for them to not involve themselves with the world of what I call Beckistan. And there's a reason for this. And the reason is because of the explosion of feminism that's come into our society and the destruction of the home that's come into the white community in the same way that the destruction of the home came into the black community. And it's happening now. And that it has to be an individual looking outside of the typical scope so they don't end up in trouble and having their lives destroyed when all they want is a solid home where they can raise children and have a partner they can be committed to for life. And this is exactly how I raise my sons. You know, I raised them so they could understand these points. I'm a Christian from a long time ago and a former director of the martial arts program for the state of Virginia for 10 years, national fighter myself on the national level, medal national fighter, and have taught martial arts and sword and weapons for many years. And I've raised my sons as best as I could and mentored the guys I can to be Christian gentlemen, but at the same time smart, so they'll understand what's going on. So here we go. It is my belief that the concept of races is a Darwinian idea that only came into functional belief at the time of Darwin's book, Origin of the Species. Now, you can study this for yourself if you want to, and I've done vast studies on it. So let me give you my explanation. Going back to Aristotle, 2,300 years ago, who was the first person to categorize all life and all things on the earth. The categorizations we study in our zoology and in our biology. He was the one that created that system of categorization. And in that categorization, he divided everything into sentient and non-sentient beings. Sentient beings mean those beings that have reasoning, and are aware. So everything else, for instance, rocks, grass, those are just natural things. They're not sentient beings. And then with the animal world, he divided them into reasoning and non-reasoning. So animals are basically driven by instinct, though you can teach them, you can teach a dog, but they're still instinctual. They operate like a pack animal. Doesn't matter how many generations away from being a wolf they are, they're a pack animal. Same thing with horses, same thing with all the other animals you deal with. But human beings are one species. And this was believed and set into being by Aristotle starting back 2,300 years ago. And it was never changed. The concept of the species was never changed until the time of Darwin. And Darwin's book, which we call The Origin of the Species, is really more than the term origin of the species, because the title of it says, The Origin of the Species and the Development of the Favored Races. So what Darwin did is he took species and subcategorized it into another step down called races. And in doing that, he violated all of science that had been understood up until that time. That's a very important point to understand. Because up until that time, there was no concept that races existed, because the word race and species were absolutely synonymous one with another. Just like until 10 years ago, the terms sex and gender were synonymous, dead on with one another. You use the word gender when you were trying to do it in a more genteel way, and sex generally when you're talking about an animal. So Darwin changed that concept, and from that moment on, for the next 100 years, men tried to create a science about races. And that's where race science started, was right directly in Darwin's book. And what they decided was there was 4 distinct races. And they were based on a cascading, descending categorization, or a building up categorization, if you want to look at the other way, from apes. Even though apes do not have the closest chromosome number to humanity, but at this time, you have to remember, Darwin had no knowledge of chromosomes whatsoever, because at the time he was writing, they had only discovered recently the microscope and had only seen cork cells at that time. They didn't even know there was such a thing called germs. People laughed at the idea there being germs. They didn't see DNA and the DNA helix until they invented the electron microscope 100 years after Darwin died. So here we are. They divided into 4 categories: white or Caucasian, Asian, American Indian, and Asian Pacific, and African. And in those categories, they started to say, well, each one of these represented a different trail of evolution. And the African was the least evolved. The Asia Pacific American Indian was second least. And the white was the most evolved. And this went on all the way through to the end of World War II in a science called eugenics. And this science dominated the Western world, especially the Germans and the American world, in the attempt to try to prove itself to be real and to be true. Now, the difference in Aristotle's concept of species and differences in human beings was this. And his was more along the line of what God says in the scripture. There are physical differences in human beings. Some have lighter skin, some have darker skin. Those are what is called incidentals. Incidentals. They don't matter. There's zero matter of those whatsoever. Because all human beings can interbreed with each other, and that's the dominant definition in the creation of a species, is the ability to interbreed and create fertile offspring. And that's the point. So in the sight of God, it's said in this way in the scripture, God has made all men one blood. And many people have tried to figure out, why did he say all men one blood instead of using another terminology? And the reason is because God looks at the DNA and the human genome, which is in the blood. It says the life of the flesh is in the blood. And so he's looking at the DNA and the chromosomal number that's in the blood. And humanity, men, women, have 46 chromosomes. And when a conception takes place, a male and a female each throw in 23 chromosomes. That's why they always talk about that